Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's meeting of the Children and Family Scrutiny Board. As everybody knows, this is the best scrutiny board in the city, if not the country. It's an established fact. My name is Councillor Alan Lamb. I'm the chair of the board. Just to explain that the meeting is being webcast on the council's website so that any interested members of the public that are unable to observe in person can still watch the meeting and follow what's going on remotely. What I'd like to do initially is to ask board members to introduce themselves, and if I can ask everyone to use their microphone, and just a reminder to mute it once you've finished introducing yourself. And if I'll go to my left first, and if I can start by welcoming Cassie, who's our new governance officer today, and if you wanted to introduce yourself first, Cassie, and we'll go around from there.
I'm Cassie Sivapala and I'm a governance officer.
Not used to being this close to you. It's Helen Bellamy, and I'm school staff representative.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Jordan Bowden. I'm a councillor in the Roundhay ward.
Morning, everybody. Nick Tones, yet to be school staff representative because due to be co-opted or not this meeting, hopefully.
Tony Britton, representing Roman Catholic Diocese of Leeds.
Karen Renshaw, councillor for Alston Robin Hood.
Good morning, councillor for Horsforth and Rawdon, Emmy Bromley.
Good morning, everybody. Councillor Denise Reagan for Bermondsofts and Richmond Hill.
Hello all, Hannah Bithell, councillor in Kirkstall. Thank you.
Morning, Councillor Jules Hesselwood, Bramley and Stanley Ward.
Good morning, Councillor Zara Hussain for the Roundhay Ward.
Hello everyone, Lisa Martin, councillor for Roundhay Ward.
Good morning, I'm Laura Whitaker, voluntary sector representative.
Morning, Kate Blacker, primary schools parent governor representative, co-opted.
Good morning, it's Jacqueline Ward, parent governor representative for our secondary schools.
Good morning, Councillor Anne Forsyth, Farnley and Wortley Ward.
Good morning, Councillor Linda Richards from Wetherby Ward.
Hello, Ryan Stevenson, representing the Harewood Ward.
Good morning, Angela Brogden, Principal Scrutiny Advisor.
Okay, thank you everybody, and a very warm welcome to today's meeting. So before we go into the agenda proper, I would just like to acknowledge and welcome Sal Tariq to our meeting this morning. It's as people will know, and I'm sure Sal will say something in a minute, but Sal is the outgoing director of Children and Families, has probably been coming to these meetings for almost as long as I have, which is quite a long time. I think it's important that we really recognise the incredible contribution that Sal has made to the city, to the council, and most importantly to the children and young people of Leeds over many, many years in different roles through the council, and took on the role of director at quite possibly the most challenging time anybody could have imagined, and really led the service and the city and all of the partners in an unbelievable way. And I don't think it's possible to really measure quite how powerful Sal's contribution has been. He wasn't really supposed to be here, but I insisted that he came this morning. It wasn't optional. He does have to leave us at 10 to 11 to go and do something probably that's far more important in London, but I'm very grateful that you came, Sal, and I wanted an opportunity on behalf of me as chair, the board, and the many boards and chairs that you've come to talk to, and always been open, always been frank about the challenges, and what's never ever been in doubt is that the only thing that motivates you in this job is trying to do the best you possibly can for children in our city. That's something I've recognised, and I hope that we all share around this table. But I just wanted to have the opportunity to thank you for everything that you've done, and for all the contributions you've made to this board. So welcome this morning. Thank you for coming, and thank you for everything.
Thanks, Councillor Lamb. That's very generous and kind of you. And, you know, just wanted to say my own thanks to you personally, because as you say, you've been involved in this journey with us for a significant period of time. And, you know, the city's children's services back in 2009 was in, you know, difficult situation, and it's taken a decade of work to get us to where we are today. And the task in terms of continuous improvement for children and families in the city remains as big as it ever was. But this board has played an enormous contribution in that work through the support and the challenge that's really vital to make sure that we stay on guard and alert and continue to improve all of the time. And that role has been publicly recognised, I think, over the years, and your leadership, particularly Councillor Lamb of the Scrutiny Board, has played a massive role. So, you know, in turn, I'd like to thank you. I'd like to take the opportunity just to say huge thanks to the political leaders across the spectrum who've supported children's services in this great journey that we've been on. We couldn't have done any of that without your support, no matter what political background. But I would also like to put on record my thanks to Councillor Pryor and Councillor Venner in her absence for the support they've given me over the particularly the challenging last few years. And also Tom Reardon as Chief Executive. You know, he has been really supportive, and I think sets the culture and standard for the organisation to operate in, and that's been vital. Also, my enormous thanks to the amazing senior leadership team that are part of which are here today, who've been so supportive and work tirelessly in the same way that you've described that I do. You know, focused on trying to make things better for children and families within the city. None of this could have happened without their support. And most importantly, I think frontline staff that are doing this work day in, day out. It's a tremendously challenging place to work. Leeds, the scale and size of it is breathtaking when you compare us to lots of other places, and the levels of poverty and deprivation that drive demand within the work that we have. People are out there really giving their all every single day to try and help children and families be the best that they can be. And it's been particularly difficult over the last few years, and it continues to be challenging at this moment in time. But their dedication is what gets us through. And you know, I'm a social worker by background, and so you know, I recognise exactly what it's like to be a social worker on the ground. But all those staff that are involved, we talk about 20,000 staff who touch the lives of children every day, right across our schools, community, our children's centres, youth workers. You know, there's a whole series of people who are dedicated to trying to improve children's lives in the city, and they do a tremendous job, and we couldn't be in the position that we are without all of their commitment and all of the partners and voluntary sector contribution that's made. So my thanks over the years to all of those people. I have been in frontline child protection work for 28 years exactly last month actually, here in Leeds. And so whilst that's been very challenging in all the roles that I've done, it's also been a huge privilege. And I've met some amazing people, some of the children, some of the families that we've worked with, but also colleagues right across the spectrum who've dedicated their working lives to children and families in the city. So moving on to a new role, which I started this week, I'm quite excited about. It is about trying to support other authorities, but also continuing to try and have a bit of an influence back here in Leeds, which obviously is my real commitment. But I want to also try and represent Leeds on the national scene. And so hopefully with national changes that are coming in, I'll be involved in some of the work that goes on around implementing the care review, and will do my best to represent Leeds on that national stage, but also to take the stuff that I've learned here to try and help other authorities across the country. So thanks very much once again.
Thank you so much, Sal. Okay, and as always in this sector, the work continues. So we will get to the agenda proper. So if I can ask Cassie, please, to take us through items 1 to 5.
Item 1, there were no appeals against the refusal of inspection of documents. Item number 2, there were no items for exclusion. Item number 3, there were no late items of business. Item number 4, could I ask any board members who have any interest to declare to make themselves known? Okay, I'll take that as a no. Item number 5, apologies. We had apologies in advance for Councillor Howley, Councillor Senior and Andrew Graham.
Okay, thank you very much, Cassie. So we move on to item 6, which is the minutes of our last meeting, which seems like 100 years ago, but it was in fact the 6th of July. So first of all, can we approve them for accuracy, please? Councillor Stevenson.
Thank you, Chair. On a point of accuracy, on page 7, it does seem a while ago now, but I purposefully listened back to the recording this morning. The last paragraph regarding response to personnel query, I don't think as written it accurately reflects the dialogue that was had. If you remember, the query that was raised was asking for confirmation of the existence of a social worker grievance. In response to that, both the Deputy Director and the Executive Member suggested that they couldn't comment on confidential personnel matters. But the point of the argument that pursued was that I wasn't asking for confidential personal information, I was asking for the confirmation of the existence of a social worker grievance. So I think on that second line, they raised a query in relation to personnel matter involving could be clarified to actually what was asked for, which was asked for confirmation of the existence of a social worker grievance. And arising from that, I did have a conversation with the council's legal department afterwards, and it was confirmed to me that there is no legal reason or confidential reason why it couldn't have been confirmed to Scrutiny that existed. But we agreed that it was never asked for the confidential information to be given, and that would have been improper. And I suppose following on from that, as the point was proven, since then a paper has been issued to the Executive Board anyway, confirming that with a lot of detail in. So it kind of proves the point that we could have had the conversation anyway. But I think for accuracy, that should be corrected, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Have we got that down? Yep. Councillor Renshaw.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to comment on what's being said, because at the time it was due to the information that some members.
Can we just so we can do everything in order? Are there any other matters of accuracy on the minutes anyone wants to raise, and then we'll comment on that?
Right. Thank you, Chair.
So with that caveat, we're happy with the accuracy. So Councillor Renshaw.
It's just that following on from the comments which have been made, the reasons why it was classed as how it's put down in the minutes is due to some people being aware of the confidential information and other members of the board not having access to it or being allowed to share that information. And I think when things are being discussed in scrutiny, it's only fair that all members receive the same information.
I think my recollection, it just feel like a long time ago now, was the question that was asked was, can the existence of a mass grievance be confirmed? That's not necessarily information anybody had around the table. The response was, we can't talk about that. And I think the point Councillor Stevenson is making was it was reasonable to ask the question, and it would have been in order to answer it. Have I got?
That's what the council's own legal advisors informed me, Chair, yes. And the point of clarification I was making was just on accuracy of the minutes. The minutes, in my opinion, should reflect the conversations had, not whether it's right or wrong. They should just reflect it. And if you listen back to the conversation and the recording, that's the point I was raising. It doesn't reflect the accuracy.
I take your point, Councillor Renshaw. Had we have been discussing something like that, everybody should have access to the same information. That's very much in my mind, but I don't think that was the point. So any other matters arising from those minutes? No. Turning myself off too soon. Item 7. We're now moving on to item about new co-opted members. So I'm going to ask Angela to take us through, please.
Thank you, Chair. So as the board will be aware, the appointment of non-voting school staff representation has been a long-standing approach adopted by the Children and Family Scrutiny Board. And following the retirement of Celia Foote in July, the School Staff Joint Consultative Committee has nominated Nick Tones to replace Celia's position on the Scrutiny Board for this municipal year. So the board's therefore asked to formally approve the appointment of Mr Tones as a non-voting co-opted member to the board. And also, as from the 26th of September, another one of our co-opted members, Kate Blacker, is also coming to the end of her 4-year term as a parent governor representative on the Scrutiny Board, and so processes are currently in place to find a replacement parent governor representative to join the Scrutiny Board from October, as this is a statutory position. However, through you, Chair, it is proposed that the board considers appointing Kate as a non-voting co-opted member for the remainder of this municipal year, and this is in view of the experience and the professional knowledge that she's brought to the board over the last 4 years, as well as the benefit of membership continuity with regards to some of the pieces of work that the board's following up this year. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Angela. So in the case of Kate, she has graciously said she'd be willing to continue, not that it was optional. So I need to put that to the voting members. So first of all, in the case of Nick Tones, are we happy to approve his appointment to the board? Seeing nods and hand raising, so I'm going to take it that that's unanimous. So thank you and welcome, Nick. And then secondly, on the proposal that we co-opt Kate for the remainder of the municipal year, all those in favour of that, please. And that is also unanimous. So thank you. And it's very good to have both of you, a new voice and a continuing voice. And I think that's very good for the board. So thank you for that. So we move on to item 8 and the meat of the agenda. So this is the refresh of the Children and Young People's Plan, an update on that. So we had a discussion about this in July, and this report that I'm sure you've all read presents an update on preparations linked to the refresh of the Children and Young People's Plan. So if perhaps I could ask all of the contributors to introduce themselves, and then I'll ask Councillor Pryor and Councillor Jenkins to make any introductory remarks, and I would imagine Chris and Ruth will then want to take us through the paper. So I think Sal has suitably introduced himself. So Councillor Jenkins.
Good morning, I'm Councillor David Jenkins. I represent Killingbeck and Seacroft, and I'm a Deputy Exec Member for Children's Services, Adult Social Care and Health Partnerships.
Councillor Jonathan Pryor. I'm Deputy Leader of the Council and Executive Member for Economy, Culture and Education.
Morning, Chris Hudson, Pod Performance Programme Manager. I'm on a listening brief today because I'm afraid I've lost my voice.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Ruth Terry, Chief Officer for Children's Social Work.
Okay, thank you for joining us. You're all very welcome. So Councillor Jenkins, Councillor Pryor, are there any introductory remarks you'd like to make?
I've very few, just to speak about how important this is. I think we've all seen the huge impact that COVID over the past few years has had on education. This academic year starting now, while there are obviously still huge impacts on children, be it kind of their mental health, whatever missed education they've had, this is almost the first the first year completely free of restrictions and changes. So it's going to be even more essential when we're looking at particularly the 3A strategy and other ways in which kind of we as a council support schools and support teachers and support pupils. It's going to be even more crucial in how those children make progress. So I won't make any more comments on that for now, but obviously more than happy to speak on points later on. But I believe Councillor Jenkins has more to add.
Okay, so I welcome any comments really on the strategy, and I think one of the things that's happened really is the fuel crisis and its massive effect on families within the city. So most families are going to be affected by a doubling of fuel costs over the next few months, even after the announcement by the new Prime Minister about the freezing of energy prices. And that is going to have a real effect on the well-being of most families. And particularly, it's going to affect people's ability to use food banks, food pantries, and so on. One of the projects that we've started in Seacroft is a slow cookers project to try and get we've got 100 slow cookers on order to give out to people to help them cope with the fuel crisis. And it's a pilot project, and we're working with the university and with the provision of ingredients, recipes, and so on, and actually the skills as to how to use slow cookers if you haven't had one before. So as a pilot project, we hope that it's going to go across the city eventually, and there'll be 1,000 slow cookers or so, which can be used to enable people to provide food that is healthy and sustainable. And particularly, my biggest worry is people who are on prepayment meters who may self-disconnect. So we've got to try and do all we can to try and get as many people onto the priority service register, which is with the electricity board, which is a means of trying to stop any disconnections happening, particularly if we've got medical conditions which involve, say, stair lifts, or even for children with disabilities who require electrical support in the home. So I think overall, to tackle poverty, we need a sort of transformation of wealth in society. This is perhaps being a bit political in a sense, but we're never going to change things if we allow the rich to get richer and the poor to get poorer. So I think as an underlying message to scrutiny, I think that is a critical factor. I think also I've mentioned a few things that have been included now about becoming a Marmot city, and hopefully that will have a significant effect over the next 5 years as to what impact being a Marmot city can have on the different aspects of trying to tackle issues around life expectancy across the city. I think I'll stop there, and hopefully you can make comments.
Okay, well, shall I ask Ruth to take us through the report? Or Sal, did you want to?
I'm happy just to say a few things. I think Chris would have liked to put some points forward, and so I've taken his notes in order to make some opening remarks with a bit of my own knowledge thrown in. So the Children and Young People's Plan has been part of our strategy for a decade now, and I think that one of the really important things about it is its longevity. In a lot of places, what tends to happen is, as there are changes in leadership, lots of organisations change the direction of travel, and one of the things that I think has been really successful here in Leeds has been the longevity of this plan. And whilst we have refreshed it and changed it over the years, the general direction of travel has remained the same, and I think that bears fruit in the improvements that we've been able to make. So as part of this refresh, we're not planning to significantly change direction. We think that it is still heading in the right direction, though there are some changes that we need to make given the context that we are operating in at the moment. We think the idea of having 3 obsessions remains a good one because it's easy in terms of communication. We use those 3 obsessions as bellwethers so that if you improve those 3 things, a whole series of things have to improve for children and families in order for those 3 things to change. So that really harnesses the energy that people are putting into this. But we are planning to change some of the language, softening the original vision a little bit, but also adding more emphasis around play and fun for children. The changes in the obsessions are we're going to keep the obsession around reducing the need for children to come into care, because that's a central focus of the work with the most vulnerable in the city. And if we concentrate our efforts on reducing the need for children to come into care, a whole series of things need to improve for children. So we think that remains strong and relevant. We're going to pull together a number of other areas in a second obsession, which is about learning. So some of our priorities around those young people not in employment, education, training can come together with our learning objectives, which will be driven forward through our 3A strategy. So that would be the second obsession. And then the third obsession, whilst there's always been a strong element of children's health as part of the overall priorities of the Children and Young People's Plan, we think being much more explicit at this stage about young people's health is really important in terms of harnessing the efforts of the whole partnership and being really specific about health being a priority, particularly I think given the mental health challenges that exist for children and young people as we emerge from the pandemic. So that would set your 3 obsessions. We've talked directly to children, as we always do in the city, about their wishes, and they've come up with 12 wishes which have been communicated, but they're incorporated as part of the consultation. And we've put priorities in around the climate emergency and transport, which are really important issues for children and young people. So that's in essence where we're trying to head with this. We'll undertake the consultation both online but also in partnership groups and directly with children over the coming 2 months. That will lead to a new draft that we can bring back to scrutiny. We're planning to bring that back here in January, and then it can work its way through the executive board and to full council next year, so that we are ready to implement the 2023 Children and Young People's Plan for the city. I'll leave it there, Councillor Lamb. If there's not any immediate questions for myself, Ruth is here and others to answer any questions, and I'll quietly slope off if there's nothing for me to respond to immediately. Thanks very much.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Sal. So there are 3 aspects that we're being asked to respond on. So first of all, the content, particularly the vision and the obsession. Then the consultation and timetable for developing and approving the plan. And finally, the implementation and monitoring. So they're the 3 things that we need to be focused on. So are there any specific questions for Sal? Tony?
Can I have an explanation for point 4 on page 22? Because pardon my ignorance, but I don't know what a Marmot city is.
Okay, who would like to respond on that one?
Can
you explain what it is?
I'd like some explanation for how this is going to affect us, how it changes, because I'm quite ignorant about what a Marmot city is.
Okay, so Professor Marmot in 2010 did a study of inequalities, particularly in health, and that was repeated in 2020, and things hadn't really changed. So a number of cities looked at whether his approach to understanding and dissecting where inequalities arise in health and life expectancy, where they come from. So a number of cities like Manchester, Coventry, Nottingham, I think, declare themselves to be Marmot cities to try and look at how to tackle those health inequalities. And essentially that's the basis of it. And Tim Fleming has just been appointed as Deputy Director in Public Health to lead on the Marmot City approach. And it would be good if you could invite him to one of your scrutiny meetings, I think, to discuss the parameters upon how that can work. I mean, we want to try and establish why people in Wetherby and Harewood live 10 years longer than people in Beeston and Holbeck. And that's a critical issue because people lose out on all sorts of issues like their state pension. The economy of an area is diminished by people living shorter lives. And people have a right to, having paid in to state pensions for their lives, to actually be redeemed in their old age. And speaking as an older person champion for Leeds, I feel quite strongly about that. Okay, well, is that all right? Does that answer your question?
And was that your question as well, Jackie? Yeah. Okay, Kate, you wanted to come?
Sorry, just to clarify then, so if you declare yourself a Marmot city, are you saying that you have those health inequalities in your city, or are you saying that you specifically want to address those inequalities, or both?
Yeah, I think the idea is that you acknowledge that those inequalities exist. I think the Marmot, the second report took account of how health inequalities had increased during the pandemic. And so the idea is to understand what those inequalities are, and the plan will be about tackling them.
So what will we be measuring around that, and how?
I mean, I don't have all of the detail to hand, but as Councillor Jenkins said, I think it might be worthwhile having some information to scrutiny about what the detail of the plans and how we measure that.
Thank you. Councillor Jenkins.
So it'll look at housing, provision of maternity services, early years, all the sorts of parameters and indicators that we would expect to look at in terms of from birth to older age. So Manchester has done most of the work in this area, and they've produced some reports which I think would provide some guidance as to what outcomes there will be.
Thank you. Councillor Reagan.
With regards to the children and young people's plan, I think it's critical that we devolve that information and that setting into all the inner and the community committee role, because what's happening in Inner East is completely different to what's happening in Outer North. And I think it links into the Marmot City in the sense of the inequalities and the things that are affecting young people and children in those areas are quite clearly different to something that's happening in the outer areas or in another part of the inner. So I think we need more consultation with not only children and young people, but with ward members and all other professionals that have a role to play in all these things that have an effect on the lives of young people. Because if young people have got a family that's not got any heating, that's not got any food, that's not got any prospects, if they've got a grandparent that's terminally ill, that's going to have a massive effect on that child's learning. So I think we've got to get back to devolving that information and that power to local community committees.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea always around the children and young people's plan was that we set the vision and priorities at a citywide level, but that actually the data that we look at must be broken down to more localized areas, and that actually the how in terms of what happens in local areas is determined locally, because those people are closest to the issues of challenge in their local areas. So that certainly remains the methodology.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a really important point. I'd always add, as someone who represents an outer area, it is not exclusively the experience for children and people in our area that everything is fine, and there's plenty of issues and challenges. However, I accept it's much more prevalent in some, and I think the point I would make is we have to make sure with this plan we don't have a one-size-fits-all approach. So how do we make sure within the plan that there's enough scope to be able to sort of make it a bit more bespoke, whether that's through community committees and local elected members, to have the ability to shape how this works in reality in their area, rather than just saying this is it from the centre, this is what we're doing and this has to work for everybody, because that's not the nature of our city.
I think you're absolutely right, and the consultation is going to be really important. So we've Sal talked a little bit about what that consultation will be. What we're proposing is that we start that in October for 6 weeks, but I think there'll be something about how we target and where we target and what those questions are, to make sure everybody's included and it's an inclusive process. There'll certainly be, and we talked at the last scrutiny board around the consultation with children, young people, and the voice and influence team will pick that up and run, and lead and drive that. So I think it's a really good point that we'll make sure is included in that consultation process.
Okay, thank you. And Andrew, did you just want to pick up on the point about Marmot cities? Because I think it's going to another scrutiny board, isn't it?
Yeah, just for clarification, originally at the proposal stage, it did actually go to the Adults Health and Active Lifestyles Scrutiny Board with their public health remit, looking at the wider determinants of health. And I understand that board is also having an update report at its October meeting. So through you, Chair, we could perhaps speak to the Chair, Councillor Marshall Catto, about the possibility of sharing information, or members perhaps joining that meeting, but I'll follow it up with the Chair.
Yeah, I think that would be very helpful. Councillor Stevenson, please.
Thanks, Chair. I was just going to build on the point that was made about outer areas as well, because I think sometimes it's the methodology that's sort of how we assess it is wrong. And the point you made, for a family in deprivation living in Conningham, access to services is much harder for those people than it is for somebody living in deprivation in the inner city. They have to travel further, the accessibility is. So when we look at this, I think not just the provision of services, but access to is quite important as well, to ensure that there is parity of access across the city. And as a comment, I think I made this comment before, in that as we look at how we'll measure the difference, how we make it, it's always useful to see what progress has been made to date as well. If there was a column somewhere it said in the last 10 years, this has increased, this has decreased, or whatever, it's quite a useful thing to track it. And I might have missed it, although I have read through it twice, but in terms of the city's response to refugees as well, I think there might be something we've missed there. In actual, I know we do it, but we don't often talk about it enough. And there are schools in the city that have taken refugee children, and a lot of good work. So I think we could probably include that somewhere.
Yeah, I think that's a personally a really valid point. I guess the point of the plan is to almost show and demonstrate what our ambition for every single child in the city is. I think some of the points that are being made by councillors today is actually correctly that the journey for individual children to reach that is going to be different, depending partially on geography, depending partially on circumstance, depending on whether they're a refugee or not, but that ambition is the same for every child, regardless of where they are. I take your point that maybe we do need to be a bit more explicit about some certain groups, for example, refugees, and it's all the work that sits directly beneath that plan that kind of discusses how that journey is different for different children in in different areas in different circumstances.
Thank you. Helen, please.
I just wanted to raise a point that I think is relevant to 3 of the 5 outcomes. So number 2, to do well at all levels of learning, have skills for life. 4, have fun growing up. And 5, have active citizens who feel they have voice and influence. And I know that there are free books for early years children, babies, and in their early years before they start school. But I think a lot of the fun has been taken out of the teaching of reading in schools. It's so focused on phonics. And the biggest incentive to be able to read and read well is something that children enjoy doing. And I just think that is an issue. I just heard Cressida Cowell this morning on Breakfast TV. I can't remember which channel it was on, who wrote How to Train Your Dragon, and she was talking about the still schools where there are no libraries, and there are children in those schools that don't have enough books. And I think we need to make sure that children have access to books that they can take home, that they can enjoy reading. I know my own children, my friends and relatives, you get a book out and they swarm around you because they know that reading is a lovely, enjoyable thing. And as I say, I just think that's an issue. And apparently 1 in 8 schools have no library, but that's higher in areas of deprivation. And I think that's an issue. All schools should have libraries where children can take the books home as well.
Thank you. Anyone want to come back on?
Should I come in on that, Councillor? I don't think I've introduced myself yet. So it's Dave Clark. I'm Head of Learning Improvement. I think you make some really valid points about the reading, and I think one of the things that we've tried really hard over the last year to link is the refreshed 3 years plan. So if you know that you'll appreciate that target. Ambition 1 is around reading. So all our focus is on reading, supporting schools with the reading, working with external agencies, for example, our library service with the Reception Reading Stars programme initiative, the summer reading scheme. So all those, so I think in terms of trying to link our strategies as a directorate with limited resources and capacity to make the most impact on those reading, and things like our advisory work the focus has been on reading deep dives within primary schools. And I think we're over 100 now of those deep dives, which then picks up a lot of those issues that you're picking up about what level of books have they got, what resources have they got access to, how they're teaching, what's the level of phonics, all those sorts of things. So hopefully we've linked those to the Children and Young People's Plan with the 3 years refresh.
Yeah, can I just... That's really good to hear, and I've not been in schools for about 4 or 5 years now working. I know going back quite a number of years, we produced book bags. This was quite a lot of years, and it was I've always worked in areas of deprivation, and we had these book bags sewn up, and they were there for any child to take home, different levels of books. And it was seen doing that, and the organisation of that wasn't seen as time when you're not teaching, because it was valued in providing that. I think it's just putting that value into the informal reading.
Yeah, I was just going to say as well, in terms of, you're absolutely right, in terms of the being read to and children enjoying that reading is very important. I know from my school as head, we spent hours creating story sacks to go home with young people so that the families could read together. And some of the work that we're doing as part of the 3 years is working with social care colleagues in terms of how do we, all those professionals working with families, how do they encourage children to be read to more and involved in that whole process of reading. I think part of it is about encouraging that love of reading and children enjoying reading, not just, and I think you're right, not just the mechanics of the reading.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Bithell is next, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I've got a couple of different points. Firstly, I'm really pleased that in the vision, the discussion we had around the importance of codifying the loving and nurturing bit has made it in. I think that's a really wonderful addition. I take on board Councillor Pryor's points around it being an objective for everyone, but I do have some fear around using specifically the term families in terms of it delegitimizing some children's situation, and actually whether we could just add families and communities or something, just to give that wider scope for where children are living, because the key bit is the loving and nurturing rather than the specific of it being a what could be read as a family unit, much as I'm incredibly aware that family units come in many different shapes and sizes. I also, with the vision, I'm a little worried to drop the vulnerable and deprived section, just because much as it's a 10-year scope of a plan, given the current circumstances we're in with the cost of living crisis and the obvious impact that is going to have on our young people, I think having it front and centre actually of making sure that those young people get what they need faster is really super important. And then the other bit is relatively small on the 11 priorities, where it talks about including walking, public transport and cycling. Can we also add encouraging scooting, because kids love it? Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Bithell. I think there's some really good things in there, and I think we were really wanted to get that love and nurturing in. I think it was a really good discussion we had at the last board, and areas around that play and fun as well that we've incorporated into the proposals. But I think it will be beneficial for us to think about that sentence, which is at the end there, isn't it, around children and people from vulnerable and deprived backgrounds, and really focusing on outcomes for them. So I think we'll take all that on board.
Thank you. Councillor Renshaw, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to ask if you're having contact with all the academies as well as the local authority schools, and whether there's any differentiation between the uptake of the projects that you mentioned. If you could just elaborate a bit on that, please.
Hi, yeah, you make a good point. We had two main projects running over the summer, which was the Reception Reading Stars and the Enhanced Summer Reading Challenge. Both of them were open to academies as well as LA maintained schools. There was no differentiation made between the two. We had a lot of interest in both projects, and we had to just go for about 12 in each project. But those decisions were made on location and proximity to libraries, and making sure that there were enough, that there was an equal amount of schools per library and per library area. So it was not the discussion between who was an LA maintained school and who was an academy just didn't feature in that discussion at all.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Forsyth, please.
Yes, thank you. I welcome the proposed changes, and I was just there's about three things I was wanting to talk about. First of all, welcoming the extra priority about the climate emergency, and coming back to the significant challenges, obviously, that we know families and everybody are facing with the energy prices. It's ironic that if we are going to be needing to save energy, that does actually align with the climate emergency, but it's not a point that I particularly wanted to make. But the point is also that schools are going to be facing a significant problem when it comes to energy prices as well. I'm speaking now as the chair of governors rather than just a councillor. So that's just a point I was wanting to sort of flag up here. So as governor, moving on to the next one, in terms of the consultation, Will governors be consulted on this? I think it did say in that whether there will be that, because that's important. The other point I wish to make is where the cluster model will be looked at that we have across the city. Because my feeling is, but I don't know, that this works very differently within different clusters, and how that will sort of dovetail into the how this is delivered, really. Thank you.
In terms of the consultation, it will be online, and we will send out through various newsletters. So governors, elected members, other groups as well. So it should go far and wide.
I was just going to come in terms of the cluster model. I do think the clusters are a significant part of our strategy in terms of delivering early help and delivering the plan. And I do think that links in with the earlier conversation we had about different areas and the needs in different areas and what that looks like, and some of that granular detail we need in terms of those needs and how we can respond to those needs. So I do think the cluster model is really essential to that, to the strategy, and in terms of, again, I think it's really important how we consult with each of the cluster areas. There is an early help review ongoing at the moment, which is considering what early help looks like across the city, and how we can make sure that all families get that help that they need at the right time.
Thank you. Councillor Richards, please.
Thank you. Yeah, just picking up on a few points that have been raised. The first one, and I would certainly, support the points that Councillor Bithell has raised regarding the new proposed vision in terms of the wording there. The loving and nurturing families do come in all shapes and sizes, and certainly one of the things which I would not like to see is that some people would feel excluded by having the phrase vulnerable and deprived backgrounds as them seeing as the only criteria. Because one of the things which I have encountered both in education is that sometimes parents and children are reluctant to go for support because they don't wish to be seen in those kind of categories. So having something which says providing young people with, I would even put providing all young people with the skills for life, because that is more inclusive, and to me it sits better with the vision that we've got there. And in terms of actually encouraging the idea of reading, I mean, absolutely, we want a love of learning, we want a love of reading in there. And having had the pleasure of taking a whole school, a whole primary school, we did on World Book Day, we went to the local bookshop, and the funding of one book for every child had been raised through the school as a very deliberate policy to enable all children, and not all of them from nice leafy backgrounds, to actually have that book, and they got to choose it. Fine. It also enabled us to engage with parents, because I think that's the other element, that how do we engage parents in this process? And you've touched on it there, but it is such a difficult one to break there, because again, what's almost being said is that at present, there isn't as much engagement as there might be. So we've got to try and do that without wishing to appear to be critical of the existing circumstance, where quite frankly, there are still lots of houses without books. They may have access to books online, they may have books in that way, but it's not the, as you said, coming together and the doing it, which again embeds that nurturing and loving element with it. So that's, the two comments that I would make there. How are we going to engage in that wider way to actually enable the very positive visions there to be put into practice?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. To pick up on your earlier point, one of the key points of the government's reading strategy, there's an appendix which is just for parents. And it makes it very clear that actually good practice is that people should have two books to take home on a regular basis, one which practices their phonics, but the other which is to be read to them to develop a love of reading. And it also, in this appendix, gives details about how to read to your child. So we've had that put into, designed in a very Leeds format. And we should shortly be rolling that out to lots of outlets in Leeds, so that people have parents get access to that, and we'll be using our social care colleagues to help us with that. We're also having it translated into the 8 main languages that are spoken in Leeds other than English, so that it will have wider currency and be more inclusive than simply a leaflet in English would have.
Yep, Kate.
I just wanted to ask about what was touched upon earlier about libraries in schools, because as we're talking, I'm thinking we've been talking about a cost of living crisis, and then we're talking about how do we encourage carers, families to read with their children. And obviously, if it comes to a choice between fuel, food and books, they're obviously going to prioritise the first two. So if we've got lots of schools that don't have libraries, and I know from experience with our primary school, which isn't a nice, privileged, I suppose you would call it, in comparison to other areas of Leeds, where there's lots of families who have lots of books at home and who can afford to go and buy books for their children, and supported the school to basically fund a library, which is amazing, but most schools wouldn't have that. How can we support schools in terms of funding for libraries? Because if there aren't books at home, if families can't afford to buy books, and there aren't libraries in the schools that the children are going to, where are they going to actually get those books from? I know there's a limited number of books that they will always have in schools to help children read, but if we're talking about children being able to go each week into the library at school and borrow a book for the week to take home, and schools don't actually have those libraries, and there's obviously a problem, isn't there? So I know obviously we've got issues around budgets for schools, but is there anything that we can tap into to try and support schools to develop libraries? Because I know from experience that it is expensive and it's a lot of work, and for schools as well, it's going to be difficult for them to find the resource for that.
Yeah, I think you're right. The importance of libraries is huge, and schools. Some schools don't have vast amounts of resources, others do. One of the things that significant numbers of, and I don't have the figures to hand, but all the maintained sectors, certainly they devolve funding to the schools library service. So lots of the schools have that library service coming into them to support them, the amount of resources they've got there in school. And then schools can add on to that and put more money into that, so they can get more books, and depending on how they want to use their resource. We also we've developed over the last couple of years stronger links with the library, the Leeds Library Service, which also provides the schools library service, and they are doing more with our head teacher briefings, so they and working closer with us to try and build those relationships, so that schools, head teachers and governors have that link with the library service of, look, if the school is saying, look, we have a significantly challenging budget, we don't have a lot of money to put into our library, because books do. I mean, I remember, replacing a reading scheme for an average primary school, maybe £15,000 to £20,000, if you want a decent scheme. So it's a significant amount of money. But actually developing those links with those services we've got in Leeds is really important. From time to time, there are charities as well that support schools to develop their library, and we sort of encourage schools to pick up on that as well. So when things come along, Eric has just written me a note here saying, Phil Mellon, who was our deputy director a few years ago, working for the National Book Trust. So there's lots of links with the National Book Trust that schools can be involved with. The Book Trust also, I think you referred to the young people reception, year 1 children getting books. They're still doing that. So we've still got those links as well. So I guess from an authority point of view, you're absolutely right. We need to be rigorous in whenever we find a link to support schools of how to develop their resources, we do that.
Sorry, can I just ask as well about children's centres? Because obviously a lot of, preschool children will go along with that. And I haven't been in a children's centre for a really long time, but I remember they were fantastic in terms of lots of different things that were on offer for families with very young children, which was mainly sort of obviously play focused, but I only really remember just a very tiny handful of books. So what are we doing in terms of supporting the children's centres as well as the schools? So I guess it would be similar, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right about children's centres, the importance of that early start. Unfortunately, I don't think any of us, the children's centres, sit within our remit, but actually it's something that we can share across, just share this conversation, and that, you know, in terms of is there information that we can provide to Scrutiny at a later time about what's happening in children's centres in terms specifically around their resources and reading material.
Councillor Bithell.
Yeah, just possibly more current experience with the tiny humans I have currently. There is still a reasonable bookshelf in the children's centres. Obviously, I've been into local ones, but because it's an adoption, we also dip into other ones across the city because of one adoption stuff is done in different bits. So the ones I've been in all seem to have a bookshelf of books which will age appropriate. But there's also a scheme, and I can't remember who runs it. I think it might be the Book Trust, where you get given reasonably regularly a book to take home as well. Yeah, maybe Bookstar, and it comes in a pack with some other little bits. I feel like we might have got more than that. It's only been a year, so maybe if you had the kid from birth, obviously, and you're getting a couple a year, that might be providing some. It's not ideal, and there's still much more we could probably do, but that's, I think, probably roughly where we're at the moment.
Just to come in on this, yeah, we did a huge amount of work with the Book Trust partnering, which involved giving books to large numbers of children. This wasn't that long before COVID. I think it was late 19, early 20. And actually one of the exercises we did in the warehouse was splitting the books up into different age ranges, because obviously, you know, what's good for a 10-year-old isn't necessarily good for a 2-year-old. And those which were for preschool were sent off to the children's centres around the city, some of them to keep in the children's centres, some as to give to gifts to young children. So there will have been those packs, there will have been those from the Book Trust, and that's something that's continuing now. It is something where I think historically has been a bit of a weakness in our attainment in Leeds, that reading at an early age. So that's why there was such a huge focus on that, which we're gradually getting back into as we kind of move on from firefighting from COVID, essentially.
Okay, I'll go to Councillor Hazelwood and then Councillor Renshaw.
No, just very quick comment on that. My son is now 16 and at the college over the road at the art college. But I remember getting the books for them when they were in primary. So I think we've been doing it, you know, for a very long time. Because I'm going back, 13, 14 years. And I know and my 13-year-old got them as well. So we have been doing it for a very long time, definitely.
Thank you. I was about to sum up and my list has suddenly got longer again. So, Councillor Renshaw, please.
So my apologies, Chair, for having to nip out. It was an emergency. I'd just like to ask, it's as well as supporting the children, do we support their parents? Because I do know of a number of parents who are very inconfident in reading to their children. And so there's like the family as a whole, and giving support to both so that it makes the parent more confident and it links in all the reading and writing and everything else that goes with it. So I just wondered if there were any family whole support.
Yeah, I think it is important to support the parents, and Erica mentioned earlier about sort of one of our focuses about how do we support families and parents to listen to their child read and hear the child read. I know a lot of schools, there's a lot of good practice around our schools in Leeds in terms of asking parents to come in to do sessions with the parents, how to work with your children, explaining how phonics works and, the activities you can do with the kids at home, how to get into a good habits about bedtimes with hearing your child, having a bedtime story, all those sorts of things. So I think a lot of schools, I guess we don't put on any specific parent training, but I know that a lot of schools have really good practice in terms of supporting their families to support their young people. And again, that's all around those barriers that that the council was talking about earlier around sort of how do you get parents involved in educating their young people and helping them develop the love of reading.
I don't know if the moment that you had to go out was the time when I talked about the leaflet that we were putting out to parents in 8 different languages. Were you here for that? Right, yeah, so I made a point that actually we're taking an appendix from the government's reading strategy about how best to read to your child, which is written explicitly for parents. We're making it into a Leeds friendly document, and we're translating it into 8 languages. So I'm putting that in a range of places so that parents will get those kind of good messages about how best to read to their child.
Yeah, just following on from that though, I do know some parents who have difficulty even reading newsletters, etc., and like to be verbally told what is in the newsletters, the contents, because they're just like that confidence and they've not had that learning opportunity themselves. And so I just wondered how that was addressed and whether there were some combined sessions within all schools within Leeds to give those parents that opportunity, which is obviously crucial.
I just wanted to comment on the social worker role in this as well. And the social workers are, I think, are absolutely pivotal in terms of particularly where we've got children with child in need plans, in supporting parents and understanding and the importance of reading and how they can do that. And we did a piece of work a couple of years ago now. I think it was probably pre-COVID. Time flies, doesn't it? Where we did, there's quite a bit of work supporting social workers to understand how to teach parents to read to their children, you know, and that was part of their plans then. So we included that in children in need plans to make sure it was kind of front and centre in terms of reading. So that was a really good piece of work at the time, is encourage social workers to understand that importance as well.
Thank you. Councillor Martin, please.
Yes, thank you. This is a question about the content of the plan. So prior to the current extreme cost of living crisis that we've known, and I've heard officers here state that the one thing that negatively impacts on children's well-being most is that of poverty and deprivation. So I agree with what's been said about the simplicity and the continuity and the consistency of this plan. But we've got a question that the officers put in Appendix 2 right at the end there. Should a measure be introduced that indicates the impact of poverty on children and young people, and what will this be? Now, I'd argue that infant mortality is a key indicator of that. But I just think that if we had some specific measure of poverty within this city, that then helps us to correlate with things like children's achievement and the number of children coming onto child protection plan, the number of children coming into care, that would be most welcome to see what the impact is of the national cost of living crisis in this country. I think that is so important. And I've heard, well, today Sal mentioned about poverty and deprivation, and I've heard him mention it in the past. It's the one thing that does in children's well-being. Thank you.
Thank you. And get Councillor Pryor.
I think you're absolutely right, Councillor Martin. I think kind of poverty and housing and everything that stems from that is going to be at the core of a lot of children's experiences. Some of this, I think, is about poverty proofing children from some of that and seeing what we can do to kind of shield some of that. But equally, there's only a limit to how far that can go. Under the section, kind of how we'll know if we've made a difference, I think there are a lot of those measures you're talking about. And it's clear that over the next coming months, coming years, we probably will see an increase in a lot of the need that people will be coming to the council for. I think it's probably worth having a look at how, just to double check to make sure how we're measuring that, to make sure we're really capturing the extent. I think one key thing that's come out in the cost of living crisis is there are going to be more people needing help and support who have never needed help and support before. It's not just going to be the same faces needing help again. And I think we need to make sure we are capturing that, because I think there's going to be a lot of people who won't want to come forward. I can't remember, I think Councillor Richards, you mentioned before about how some people, we don't want people to feel necessarily shame for needing support, but actually that is a reality. Sometimes people won't want to come forward, and when more people are needing that help, we do need to make sure we're capturing that accurately. There are small ways around it. I know that Councillor Heselwood and Councillor Bethel, I've seen, have done a school uniform exchange, which I'm sure many other members have done as well. And actually, when we link that to some of the climate arguments that I know Councillor Forsyth mentioned, that takes some of the stigma out of it, because actually it's about stopping waste. It's about preventing kind of people paying money for things that will just get thrown away. But actually, there are going to be several families that will be an absolute lifeline for. So there are small interventions where we can kind of poverty proof, but equally we don't hold all the levers to prevent that poverty. But I do think it's really important we capture the shift in poverty over the next few weeks and months.
Thank you for that. We've still got a few people to go. And
Sorry,
I'm conscious...
can I just follow up on that?
Quickly.
Yes, I know that Leeds, and I know that colleagues across this city, both officers and councillors, are doing so much to mitigate against this and manage this decline. But what I want to understand is the impact of the central government choices on this city, and to see that and not be masking it. I know Councillor Jenkins talked about slow cookers. I'm involved in setting up better uniform exchanges. Those are all mitigations, aren't they? It's the actual sort of scale of the problem that I'm also interested in. Thank you.
Okay, I think that point's noted, and we can pick that up when we're summarising. So I've got 4 more people to contribute. I'm not going to take anybody else because I'm conscious of the time, and then we need to summarise. So if I should be as brief as you can, please. So Councillor Bowden first, please.
I think, oh yes, I am on. Having worked in primary education for 9 years, I just thought I'd make a couple of comments of really good practices and hopefully alleviate some people's concerns of some potential areas, but also where I do think there has been really good contributions. So the issue of the overemphasis of phonics is an interesting one. I was a phonics interventionist for basically the majority of the 9 years, the revision of learning to read kind of came in after the Rose report some time ago now. I remember personally, so what I can remember in primary education, there was, I think when I was in primary education, the idea of learning to read was almost by failure. You learned by failure, but the one benefit has come out of phonics is it is very formulaic. It is far easier in a way to teach and learn phonics, but that also comes with a negative, which is it's actually far easier now to identify areas where there are gaps, which then has an increased pressure on teachers and people in education to plug those holes. So I can understand the frustration of where of the overemphasis of phonics can be an issue, but it's almost as a result of how effective it is. So there was that. In regards to not having physical libraries, what I can say is working in predominantly areas of high deprivation, we've got ever expanding classes and schools. So those having such a large area for a library can be really, really difficult. It might not even be that they might not necessarily have the money to provide the books. It might not be that they have a practical area, but what I have seen is that many classrooms are really, really well stocked. And most classes do allow children to take books home. But I think what I did see as practices that can be really pushed on is the idea of the love of reading. And it could be practical things such as actually really not doing a good job at displaying the books, having every book being the books that the children would say take home and read with the parents might be a book they've already read in class. And so when they take a book home, are they going to really want to reread it for the third or fourth time? And it is almost talking in regards to the comments about poverty. That is in a way one of the biggest areas that I did see. So in regards to love of reading, there is a really clear indicator for those children's reading levels that do have time spent in home and the parents read to them. And when you do have those frank conversations with parents, those in those areas and those families that do have and do suffer from poverty, both parents are working like dogs to live. And so the idea that then them parents who are both working at home, the child might be being looked after by a grandparent or a family friend, they come home, the parents then have to cook and clean. There is a lot of time wasted when you're poor. It might not seem like waste because you're trying to live, but there is a very clear correlation. And being in education, what I will say is the reading levels are intrinsically linked with other subjects. So if there's any sort of, if I can sort of alleviate any concerns in regards to this, I don't think there is any head or teacher who doesn't rack the brains every day about reading levels and the attainment in reading, because reading is so linked with every other subject. So it is a critical thing that all teachers really want the children to do well in reading. So yeah, if there was anything, it would be the only concern that I have really seen is building on that love of reading, and a big one is children being read to, and potentially the time spent in class where a teacher feels like they have the ability to be able to read to children, because sometimes we've got spellings, you plug in holes. Actually being able to sit down for 15 minutes and just to be read to sometimes can be a last priority for a teacher. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'll take all of the last comments and then we can sort of summarize where we've got to. So Helen was next, please.
I will be quick. Just one point about making sure that parents know that if they've got poor reading skills, they can still read with their children, because using the pictures and predicting and picking up on the context, all of that is really important. And we should be encouraging parents not to be embarrassed and to know that they can still add value to their children's reading. And the other thing is just to add, would it be possible to have permanent areas of donation that maybe at recycling points or set up in schools? But I think recycling points would be a good place. Some parents don't like to come in if they find schools, I don't know, it's the establishment still as welcoming as they are. But I'm just thinking, wrap your books up securely, just in a bag them and just donate them. And then because there isn't the money, we've got recycling, we've got of clothes, whatever, just get something like that set up and then get those books given out to families that can't afford them.
So thank you. Councillor Stevenson, please.
Thank you. On the point of reading, I wondered if one of the things that my wife and I noticed when we're out with friends who have children these days, if you sit at dinner, it's surprising how many people just stick an iPad in front of the kids to keep them quiet at the end of the table. And so a lot of families obviously do have iPads and reading modules stuff. So instead of just talking about the physical books, is there a program, an app the city's got somewhere you can download these books for free, so that parents who do have those tablets, etc., can utilize them, which in turn would obviously free up the hard copy books for those who might not have the tablets?
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Bithell, please.
Thanks very much, Chair. Yeah, again on reading and the leaflet. I wonder whether we'd be able to include one of the things that I sometimes utilise if I'm having to have my mind split places, is YouTube already has a whole load of books that are already pre-read on there. And actually, as long as you tell them when to turn the page, because you know the book, you don't specifically have to sit with them and read. So whether we can include something along that lines might be useful. Also, there's a lot of things, I don't know how old the leaflet is looking to go up to in terms of young people, but as a geography teacher, I used to really regularly say to young people that actually they should be reading newspapers like The Guardian, because actually the reading age of a GCSE geography paper is the same reading age as The Guardian. So it might be worth doing a little bit of analysis so that obviously other newspapers are available, so that we know that they do hit the correct reading ages, and then we can put that in to be utilised as well, because it also gives that citizenship, PSHE stuff and wider world community in. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Right, are there any responses on those last few points, and then we can summarise where?
So it's maybe to Councillor Stevenson in terms of the apps, and I think there's an awful lot of different apps, and even school-based apps where the whole school can be on a reading scheme or a phonics scheme that the kids can access either in class or at home. Lots of other ones that the kids can download and do in their own time. There's not many sort of advantages to pandemic, but actually that sort of move to an online resource has actually quickened due to the pandemic. So I think there's a lot more kids accessing online reading materials, which is actually a real benefit. And I think schools they've also got more of their own resources on their sort of like learning site now. The government the DfE have put sort of through the Oak Academy, there's more resources on. So I think it's making sure that schools know how to access all that and tap into that. But yeah, there's a great resource to be used there, Councillor Stevenson.
Just to pick up on a couple of points. Firstly, the hard copy books. You're absolutely right. We can make more of online resources, but we've been involved in a project run by Leeds University with 10 schools, 10 primary schools, looking at the effects of the pandemic on learning. And one of the interesting findings from that was that pupils who had access to hard copy books actually had made more progress than those who didn't. So obviously that's 10 schools, that's very localized, but it is something that we're really quite interested in and that we're doing some follow-up work on. The other thing is to pick up on Councillor Bithell's point. As a secondary teacher by trade, I go into lots of secondary schools. There's a huge focus at the moment, both by Ofsted and by us as a school improvement service on secondary reading and making sure that secondary reading, that all pupils have the competencies that they need in order to access the curriculum. And it's often a focus now of curriculum planning that there'll be academic texts within each curriculum plan, each curriculum area, so that they extend a pupil's knowledge, like you say, of the sort of broader issues to do with that particular subject area. So that is very much a focus now of curriculum planning, to reassure you.
You let me take so many liberties, Chair. Thank you. I think
we don't seem to have reached that ceiling yet.
I think what I'm more thinking of is ways that parents can engage. So the Guardian app obviously is free, and then so I just give an idea of what we were looking at that term and get them to look at the keywords in the articles so that they had some indication, because it's actually quite an assault on the senses and overwhelming if you look at those apps and don't have any targeting. But yeah, it was more about being able to access it at home.
Okay, right. Let's try and summarise where we're at, and we've had some very, very powerful contributions this morning, and then if we just get a final response from the officers to make sure they're comfortable with what they think we've said. So in terms of the content of the plan, I think overall, with some tweaks to reflect on, the board are broadly comfortable with the content, the vision, and the obsessions. Would that be fair to say? Yep. In terms of the consultation and timetable, I think the importance of making that broad, using community committees, I think was a very powerful suggestion. Through that, then the clusters, and making sure, one thing I'd really stress, having been on the end of many such consultations, is making sure it's specific to the community you're going to talk to, and not just going with a generic repeated plan over and over, because you won't get the best value from it. And then in terms of implementation and monitoring, which comes back to that, I think it's the importance of it not being a one size fits all plan, but that it is, there's an overall strategy, but how that is implemented, delivered and monitored may very well be different in different parts of the city, and engaging with different groups, local members, clusters, schools, to figure out how that will actually work in practice, is really important to getting the maximum impact. So I think, Angela, have I missed anything important?
No.
And so is there any final response you want to make on the things you've heard from the officers, or Councillor Pryor or Councillor Jenkins, some things to take away from the session?
I'm happy to sum up. I think that's been a really useful discussion. There's plenty for officers to go away and to work on. And actually, quite a far-reaching discussion. I know we went quite beyond the scope of the plan, but for me as an exec board member, it's been really useful to get an idea of things the board wants us to look at and work on in the future. So thank you.
Okay, and so what are the next steps, please? So if you just set out quickly the timeline of the consultation, and then when we'd expect to see something back.
So we're proposing to start the consultation at the beginning of October. Chris has been working on some of the questions, and I think today's discussion is going to be really helpful just in terms of formulating those, and reframing some of them if we need to. It'll be a 6-week, we're proposing a 6-week consultation, and then to come back to this board in January. I think, is it the 25th of January, around that date, with the outcome of the consultation and a bit of a draft kind of plan, you know, in response to that, with a view to executive board in March.
Good. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for your comments, and thank you for the time. Chris, hope you get your voice back soon, but we certainly heard your contribution loud and clear through everything. So thank you for battling through this morning. Okay, so we're moving on now to item 9. Which is the schools bill. Obviously, everyone is very welcome to stay if they wish to. I think everyone has introduced themselves now. So what we're talking about is that on the 13th of May this year, the schools bill was introduced to Parliament, which aims to implement many of the policies set out in the government's Opportunity for All, Strong Schools with Great Teachers for Your Child white paper, which was published in March this year. The report, which has been provided by the Director of Children and Families, presents a summary of the schools bill and an opportunity for us to consider that. So I'll ask Councillor Pryor if he wants to make any opening comments, and then I'm guessing Dave is going to take us through the paper.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so the paper sets out the contents of the government schools bill. So obviously, kind of with reference to the Scrutiny Board, I suppose we'll be discussing how that could impact schools in Leeds. It's probably worth noting that this bill is still going through Parliament. So what's in front of us isn't necessarily the final version of what a final Act of Parliament may look like. It still may be amended. It's probably also worth mentioning that the original schools white paper, which set out a number of ambitions of the government, haven't all made it to the bill, or they haven't all made it to the bill as strongly as the government has initially put forward. There's just a few specific points I want to address to almost preempt where I think some of the discussion might be going. Point 62 in the paper talks about that it's clear that it is still the government's ambition that all schools become academies by 2030, but actually some of the teeth has been taken out of the original white paper. They're no longer mandating all schools to become academies by 2030, which I think is a key distinction, particularly for Leeds, which is a local authority with a large number of local authority and a large number of successful local authority schools. as a local authority, I think it is our duty to continue to keep those local authority schools. So while the government may be pushing it, they're no longer making it a legal requirement. On point 21 in the paper, they talk about how this legislation, should it pass, would give councils the ability to put academy orders on local authority schools. I would probably want to put it on the record now that even if that is a power that is granted to councils, it is not one that I would ever exercise so long as schools are within my portfolio. We work well with academies across the city. I've always taken the view that they are all Leeds children, and as a council we need to be working with them all. In fact, when I first got the schools portfolio back in 2018 I was speaking to one head teacher and said, look, academies have always been part of the education landscape for me. You know, they were around when I was at primary school. And he said, oh, I didn't know you taught at primary school. And I said, no, they were around when I was at primary school. So academies have always been part of that education landscape. And should a governing body wish to make that move, that is something the local authority will, of course, work with them on. But I don't consider it my place as an executive board member to be putting academy orders on schools and forcing them to convert. Obviously, I've mentioned that as Leeds has a large number of local authority schools. It is worth noting that across Leeds, our primary schools, we have an 88.2% overall schools are good or outstanding. Of our local authority schools, that statistic is at 95%. In secondary schools across Leeds, 81.4% of them are good and outstanding. And as of our local authority secondary schools, that figure is at 100%. So there isn't an argument, I believe, that conversion automatically improves a school. I think good schools can be academies, of course, they can be local authority schools, but I'd reiterate my previous point that I think it is the local authority's role, it's our role to look after those schools that want to remain within the local authority. I am interested in where this is going to go. Yesterday, obviously, we had a new Secretary of State for Education. I believe it is the 5th Secretary of State for Education I've had while I've been looking after schools. We already know that some of the ambition of the government has been watered down already. So I'll be interested to see how that further waters down. My frustration with this bill is that when I go around schools and talk to teachers and head teachers, they talk to me about SEND funding. They talk about the backlog of repairs in schools. They talk about energy bills, how they're not going to be able to settle their budgets. They talk about school places, how local authorities can't build new schools to address where children are being born and living. They talk about the 8% per pupil cut since 2010. They talk about the real term pay decreases for teachers. No teacher has ever raised to me the issues that this bill is attempting to address. And I think when there are so many things that need addressing in the world of education at the moment, this bill just strikes me as pure ideology over practicality. So those are my thoughts on the schools bill, and I would be really interested to hear what the board have got to say on it. Thank you.
Dave, did you want to add anything?
Thanks, Councillor Lamb. So we've sort of put the summary of the bill into a report format. So hopefully that's pretty self-explanatory. It's probably a few things if I just run through just to put some context in terms of where the bill is attempting to address. So, I think Councillor Pryor mentioned that it's the government's ambition that by 2030 all schools will be based within an academy. And the DfE aims to support this ambition through the schools bill and pretty much by establishing a set of trust standards, by increasing their intervention powers and by making it easier for faith schools to academise. I think one of the main focuses within the bill is around academies, and they're intending to create a set of academy standards which would effectively work as a common rule book really for academies into one document. The new legislation plans to make it easier for the Regional Schools Commissioner or the DfE to intervene at a trust level rather than an academy, in individual academy level. The other thing that I think I've highlighted in the summary is around both maintained schools and academies with a religious character have specific freedoms and protections which don't apply to other schools and which play a key role in safeguarding the religious character of the school. For local authority schools, these protections are underpinned by legislation, whereas for academies, it's on a slightly weaker footing at the moment, and so the bill is attempting to address that. There's further proposals in the bill, as you'll have seen, specifically relating to land, and are intended to remove barriers, preventing faith schools from joining MATs. There's information there about the school seeking to ensure grammar schools are secure within the MAT structure and preserve the rights of parents, allowing parents to decide whether existing grammar schools should be retained. This is the case for maintained grammar schools currently, but not for academy schools, which is the reason why the government have put that in. Under existing legislation, academy orders can only be issued to schools where the governing body has applied to convert or where there's underperformance. The legislation, if enacted, like Councillor Pryor was saying, will enable local authorities to initiate the conversion process to academies. There's significant additional proposals in the bill that you'll have read regarding funding and a move to a single national funding formula, attendance, home education, independent schools, and teacher conduct. There'll be a proposal in the bill which places a duty on local authorities in England to establish and maintain a children not in school register, which I think has been part of the Scrutiny Board's discussion previously. So I think that's probably a welcome addition into the bill, so that actually local authorities know where all children are of school age. There's legislation also aims to set a consistent standard of attendance, support for pupils and parents and local authorities. One of the impacts from the bill, if it's passed through in its current form, will be that local authorities will be required to use their existing powers with a view to promoting regular attendance and reducing the number of absences, and have regard to new attendance guidance issued by the Secretary of State. So there's significant new attendance legislation within the bill, and that sort of gives a little bit of a flavour. I think Councillor Pryor mentioned it. It's for school governing bodies to decide around the academisation process. We're still waiting for a lot of detail from the DfE. We've had a number of meetings with them. We expect DfE to publish a prospectus this term or probably next term about their academisation plans locally. So we don't have that information yet. So like schools, local authorities are still waiting for further detail and clarity. And I think that's probably where I can leave it there and open it for discussion, Councillor Lamb, if that's useful.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. That's very helpful. So we'll open up to comments and questions. If I can put the timely reminder, this is not the forum for a political debate. So I don't want to be in a position where I have to ask anyone to stop what they're saying. So if we can just focus on what's in front of us, I'd be very grateful.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you to Councillor Pryor for that really good summary of the schools bill. I'd just like to draw attention to very locally Roundhay School as being just a great example of a local authority school outstanding in our ward. Thank you.
Noted. Laura, please.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to ask a question about 57 on the bill, which is the new registration rules for full-time education where there's 5 or more pupils. One of my colleagues in the voluntary sector was just wondering if there was any thought on the impact of that on young people who maybe are in alternative education provision, which aren't currently registered, where the focus is on that engagement and relationship with the young person that has a slightly different I guess, educational attainment priority, and whether that would impact on their ability to provide provision to schools and support the education journey for young people.
Yes, thank you. That part of the legislation actually for quite some time now, with prior legislation, actually provided that same duty upon the local authority. So it isn't necessarily new. There has always been that duty where the local authority and providers of education need to be registered, and the local authority's duty then that sits all around that. So actually 5 or more children receiving education that is within a setting, and particularly if one child is looked after or anybody has got an education, health and care plan, it has always been the case that it needs to be registered. So I don't think that that is going to make a significant difference to the current way that they operate. In terms of provision that sometimes is classed more as a therapy, so there are some kinds of provisions, particularly within the world of special educational needs, where children can attend it for part of the time, then it is the school's duty to ensure that it is appropriate, that there are safeguarding things that are in place, and that it's the schools that must go to that particular provision and ensure the quality aspects that sit around it. So all of that currently exists. So I'm not sure that it will make such a significant change within the actual practicalities and pragmatics of schools operating.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry, I maybe didn't articulate it quite so well there, but I think you answered it in that second point. I think maybe Councillor Pryor, your comment around not pushing to academise all schools is probably part of the answer that they were kind of looking for in terms of the response as well. I think the concern was that an academisation of all school settings would bring in a framework that wouldn't allow for those nuances that recognise the different packages of support that are so rich across the city for children and young people. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bithell, please.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you for the timely reminder. I'll try and be as unpolitical about this monstrosity as possible. In terms of the impacts on schools' funding, there's a few things where it's talking about us handing over sites, the funding agreements differing. Have we done any cost analysis in terms of what impact that will have both on the local authority but also on the schools themselves? We're talking, I think this is around the academies having a simplified funding agreement, but that will mean some of our schools, I guess, have a change in their funding arrangement if it's based on different papers. So it'd be good to know what the specific schools are likely to feel. The register of children not in school, it seems really clear on the duty of everyone except the schools on registering and giving information about the children not in school. It talks about the duty of parents to provide information, and I just wondered what the school's role on that was. And then I just wanted to flag my devastation, I guess is probably right, on point 45 around the increase in the fine. I just can't fathom how putting an increased fine on a family with a school refuser, or imprisonment, absolutely, but realistically, hopefully, I anticipate that wouldn't actually be used, although you never know. So my question is, we know how difficult it is to get some young people into school, and this massive stick at parents, I don't believe is going to help. So what are we as a local authority with our stripped back funds going to be able to do to try and make sure our families don't end up now in thousands of pounds of debt, as well as with children who are struggling to get educated? Thanks.
Do you want me to do the fund a little bit on the funding one first? So in terms of the academy funding, I'm not 100% sure what impact that would have in terms of their funding streams, because we don't have that information within the local authority. It's likely that because the government has been moving over a number of years to a fair funding formula, there's less of an impact because it's been sort of gradually moving to that. From a maintained sector, so from the 170 odd maintained schools that we've got, the local authority itself, the finance team, have been again moving to a system where they're running effectively the national funding formula with smaller tweaks to the local formula. So at the minute, so historically, hasn't it been, it's been that, you know, the government, the DfE have given the money to the local authority, who then put their own criteria to it and then distribute it to schools. I think the schools finance team over the last number of years, knowing that a funding formula was coming in, has used that as the core and then reduced the amount of criteria applied to that funding formula. So I think the percentage between what it could be and what it currently is will be less. So there will be an impact, you know, depending on that final move to a hard formula. But at the minute, they're on a soft formula with less. So it's something, Councillor Booth, you're absolutely right, and that our schools finance team are keeping their eye on. There's a consultation still going on at the moment with the national funding formula, so we don't know the final arrangements about that. But as soon as we do, we can have a look at what impact that would have on the schools. So hopefully that helps. And I think, Valerie, you're going to pick up on the fines.
Yeah, in terms of the fines, there's two different pathways that are identified within the bill. So one is very much about children that are not on a school roll at all. So that is where the school attendance order comes in, and where the local authority give a preliminary notice. And the preliminary notice is basically to parents to say, you must identify and give evidence that it is suitable education is being provided for that young person. So that is the one pathway that came through all of the consultation which was around elective home education, because currently the legislation does not make it mandatory for a parent to tell the local authority that a child is being educated at home. So within the bill, it's very much focused on the local authority ensuring they know where every child is and that they're receiving a suitable education. So initially, the local authority would give notice to the parent to provide that evidence. If the evidence provided demonstrates it's suitable education, then they go on the register that now has to be, every local authority has to keep. Leeds already keep a register of all those that we know, but it will just be so that it's mandatory that every parent must do that. If a parent doesn't provide that information, that is where we're talking about the high level fines, £2,500, or actually 3 months imprisonment. So that is about actually them providing the information to ensure that a child is receiving suitable education. So that's where that pathway is. The second pathway that is within the bill is around the attendance. And that is really about fines for non-attendance and penalty notices for non-attendance. And that is making the whole system around non-attendance and fines so that nationally across the whole country, it's all brought in line. Because at the moment, there is great variation between different local authorities. You know, some local authorities, schools within that local authority can move to a penalty notice within 2 days of a child not attending. Within Leeds, we have 5 days work before we would move into a penalty notice. But also very clearly within the bill, it's the duty now on the local authority to support the schools and to support the families before you even get to that situation where you're looking at a penalty notice. So that has changed completely. What previously was the case, it was the school's duty to ensure good attendance, and we as a local authority were trading with schools to support them in their duty. This turns it around and actually says it is now the duty of the local authority to support the schools, to support the families, and to work with those families. So we've already started to put a whole plan together of how we can identify the schools that need the greatest support and how we can work with those families. So there are different pathways between the two. And I know sometimes it is confusing, and because we have not yet got all of the regulations that sit behind all of this, some of that interpretation we're still waiting for.
Very quickly, please, because I'm conscious of time.
Just with us being mandated to support academies, is there therefore a mandate in the bill for them to have to work with us and accept our support?
Yeah, as part of it's written into the bill about academies, they will have a new expectation that they work with external partners, local authorities, so it can't be that academies would be isolated, the trust would be isolated. They've got to, as part of their whole operation, work with partners.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Heselwood, please.
Yeah, one of my points was regarding the direct funding of schools, which Councillor Biddle has brought up, as I was Councillor Pryor's deputy for a number of years, looking at every year, looking at the funding and how that was distributed, and obviously schools who needed more help were given more help. So I have the same concern that direct funding will prevent that happening. So that's one thing, but obviously Councillor Biddle's touched on that. My second point is regarding point 7 on here. Sorry, I'm just flicking around. There will be new collaborative standards requiring trust to work constructively with partners. Now, before you say this is a political point, it's not, Councillor Lamb. My concern is that we have academies that don't work with their trade union, the recognised trade unions, which prevent staff from being fully able to raise a grievance or a complaint, or to have that negotiated and done on their behalf. Now, the schools bill is there. Yes, we have a lot of children in schools, but we also have a lot of staff in schools as well, which are teachers and support staff in those schools who equally need to be protected and looked after. So my concern is under number 7, that they should constructively work with the recognised trade unions, because obviously some don't pay into a facilities pot, which prevents those trade unions going in and being able to speak to those teachers who need help. I'm not talking in general, I'm talking the teachers who have raised an issue, need help. So I do hope that leads to academies understanding that and allowing those staff to be fully represented and having access to those representatives when they need them, and not in their own time and only on under certain provision. So I just wanted to make that point. I think it's very important that this is we need to look at staff as well as pupils under this schools bill and make sure staff are equally represented as well.
Okay, anyone want to come back on that, or just happy to note the comments? Yeah, thank you. Helen is next, please.
It was just following on from what Councillor Biddle said. Will there be any, will certain groups of schools not benefit from as much funding as they have done in the past with this change in the funding formula? And then I imagine you've said that you're already preparing for that. You knew that it was coming. I imagine that you've put other things in place if you've had to make the funding more equal rather than necessarily more fair, and relating to the needs. So I just wanted to ask that question, really.
Yeah, I think in terms of the funding, there will be when it moves to a hard, if it does move to a firm hard national funding formula where it's based on number of pupils and the criteria that's set nationally, it's likely that there will be slight changes, but actually, again, the local authorities been using smaller and smaller criteria which would change the funding level that they get now. So I think schools wouldn't see big swings in funding, and it's also worth remembering that funding for SEN would remain with the local authority for academies and for maintained schools. So in terms of those funding streams, that would remain the same, which is where quite a lot of the significant funding changes are depending on the level of SEN need in school. And like you say, I think we will know more once the consultation's finished. It will also enable, because the other thing that may change is in terms of how much we can de-delegate from maintained schools budgets to do the additional things that the local authority provides. Currently, there's only certain criteria of things that we can de-delegate back from schools. That may change, and the government may be saying actually local authorities will be able to request delegation from the schools forum for more areas of its work to support the maintained schools. But again, we wait for that final consultation.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Forsyth, please.
Yes, and I'll try to be reasonably brief looking at the time. Councillor Pryor, thank you very much for saying what you did about the position that your position would be about whether you would actually use the Academy's order. I have to say, reading this bill, having looked at the previous iteration, there is some relief on the fact that they put back the date where they would wish all schools to become academies to 2030 and then not making it mandatory. So I'll try not to be too political about this. This is basically as a teacher rather than politically. I think, and thank you as well, Councillor Pryor, for sharing the figures about the position of the local authority schools compared to the academies in Leeds, which is, if you like, evidence that the LA is obviously providing a very good service for that. Just a few things. Yes, I mean, I think it is welcome that obviously that they're basically bringing in the trust standards or changes to the trust standards, and also the ability to actually intervene at the trust level. And also has already been mentioned about the children not in schools with there being an education register. Just a couple of points on, where are we? 40 and 41. Back again to the register of the children not in school. Can I just ask about the out of school education providers, what those are at present, or what that refers to really, and also what the impact of 41 would be for the council being a requirement to provide registered home educating families where it's required. It sounded like quite a large statement to have read there. Thank you.
Yes, in terms of 40, you said, was it out of school education providers required to provide information? This is where potentially it refers to the first question that we had about 5 or more children attending a provision. So you may have what is called different times of the day or flexible schooling where children may attend other types of provision. And that can be part of an elective home education package that a parent puts together. And at this point in time, those provisions that parents choose to send their children to don't have to be registered and don't have to provide information to the local authority. This proposes that there will be a duty upon all of that provision that is out of school provision. Doesn't matter how many hours it is, but if it is considered to be a main element within a child's education package, that those providers will also have to inform the local authority of the specific children that are attending that provision. And this is the double check that sits around it to ensure that we know of all of the children in the city that are being electively home educated or not attending a maintained school and academy or another registered school. So that is what that is about. We have not yet got all the regulations that sit around that. So we don't have lots of detail on it of exactly what that will look like. They're going to send out further information, and I understand there's going to be a further consultation specifically on which provisions, which kind of schools will be included within that particular element of the bill. In terms of the support for registered home education families, again, we are waiting for the regulations that sit around that in terms of the support that would be required. At the moment, we have just been told that it will be around advice about the education of the child and whether it is suitable. So the local authority would work with a family to provide that advice. It may be information about sources of assistance for the education of the child. It may be about provision of facilities, including financial assistance that may sit around it, or it might be access to non-educational services or benefits. But again, we do not have that detail at the moment of exactly what that support will look like.
Okay, thank you. Jackie, please.
There's just two things. The first one would be, have you any concerns regarding a white paper and how it would affect Leeds? Is there anything in there that's flagging up? And secondly, is there better information sharing between the DFE and the council? Because that's always been a problem. You know, is it in the white paper? I know we've got all different aspects of it, but for example, would the academies tell, you know, the council about attendances and stuff like that, because it goes to DFE from academies, not to the council, as far as I'm aware. It's just better information sharing. Is that in the white paper between the two?
Okay, thanks, Jackie. I think on the first bit, Councillor Pryor covered his concerns pretty well in his introduction. So perhaps we can just focus on the second part of the question.
I'm happy to elaborate further on them if
I'd be even happier if you don't. Thanks.
In terms of information sharing, no, that's not a huge element of this bill. And we're standing Councillor Lamb's plea. My main concern is around a continuing centralisation of education and a consolidation of power in Whitehall. I think it moves decisions away from Leeds. It moves decisions away from local. It moves away democratic accountability and just consolidates power in London, in Whitehall, which I just think goes completely against all the other objectives around devolution and levelling up. But yes, as Councillor Lamb says, I covered much of that in my opening remarks.
Thank you. Yeah, Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, can I just say as well that Leeds up till this year has been sat within the Leeds and the Lancashire and West Yorkshire Regional Schools Commission area. From this year, it moves into the Yorkshire and Humber area. So there'll be that opportunity, won't there, to create those new relationships with DFE and build those relationships within its new sort of geographical location.
Thank you. Nick, please.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on point 65, if I may, which is to do with teacher training. There is a concern, and there have been concerns expressed, that the removal of the local authority's ability to be an appropriate body gives the teaching school hubs, and forgive my educational imagery, the chance to mark their own homework, especially seen as a teaching school hub cannot be identified as outstanding if they fail any of their students. So there's a concern that there isn't an oversight there, and there is an essential conflict of interest. I don't know what the council's view is on that. Thank you.
It's certainly a concern, and I think it goes to the wider point of it essentially moves and removes the local authority and removes Leeds City Council, removes a democratically elected body from much of the process and centralises a lot of that power in Whitehall. I think that has been a problem again and again. I think it's fair to say it's not always been a problem with all academy trusts by any stretch. And I think over COVID, I think what we really demonstrated was how well the local authority worked with a lot of other bodies in a crisis. But now we are returning to kind of normal times, as it were. It's so important to ensure that kind of the city can come together to make sure we are educating all young children, all young people to a certain degree. And that requires involvement of the local authority. So it is disturbing to see the local authority continually being written out.
Okay, thank you. Kate, please.
Thank you. So I just wanted to briefly come back to elective home education, because I was just wondering, I know we've touched upon this in the past. We've now got a duty to provide support to electively home educated children and families, but look at suitability, is that correct? But what I'm wondering is, what are our powers if we are of the view that it's not suitable and the family's parents don't agree?
Yeah, absolutely. So that duty upon the local authority is where we talked about that preliminary notice now. So where we are requiring a school, a parent to provide evidence of the education that's being provided. So the local authority then look at the information provided and judge whether it is appropriate or not. That is where the support element will come into play, where potentially you then work with that family to ensure that what is being provided is suitable. If the local authority determine that what is being provided is not suitable, or indeed the evidence is not provided, that is where you go down the route of a school attendance order, where potentially it's a fine or imprisonment. So there's a support element before you even get to that point. But yes, there are now powers within the local authority, one to actually demand the evidence that it is suitable education, which we didn't have before. And the second one then will be the administration of a fine, which is a significant fine. And the school attendance order then will stay in place for that family. Previously, what we've had to do is redo the whole process, looking at whether what is being provided is suitable each time. But the legislation is suggesting that once you have had evidence that it's not suitable, you then would be able to continue along that same pathway and ensuring the child is attending school, so they're not missing out, whole weeks of schooling while you go through a process.
Sorry, can I just come back? So just in terms of suitability then, do we have anything yet around that, or is that going to be in the regulations that we don't have yet? Because I can just see, because of the complexities from the pandemic, the increase in mental health difficulties compounded now by the cost of living crisis, we've got so many more complex families, so many more presenting issues, difficulties, challenges within families, and in terms of children's needs as well. So I'm just wondering around the potential for conflict about what's suitable for a particular child in a particular set of circumstances, and whether we might see some difficulties with that, potentially some litigation, dare I say it, etc.
Yes, indeed. And in fact, in the consultation, there was a move to actually have suitable defined within law, because at the moment what it says is age, aptitude, ability and special educational needs, if any. So if a child has an education, health and care plan, then you do have an assessment that's identified what is suitable. But outside of that, the scope of it, as you say, can't say, is very much, it's wide. So actually defining what is suitable then becomes the judgment of a local authority at the moment. They have not yet suggested that there will be a closer definition of what suitable is, and that it will be drilled down into the academic areas. So it is still this global term that is around age, aptitude, ability, special needs.
It'd be quite interesting if you can maybe feed back to the board at a later date around how that's been developed. Thank you.
I've got a proposition on that at the end, Kate. Councillor Stevenson, please.
Thanks, Chair. Dave, on para 71, the references to whether requires improvement schools might be brought into the scope of. Is there any more detail around how that might work. At present, it just says around discussions, but is the intention that it would be made the same as inadequate?
Yeah, no, we haven't got any further information, Councillor Stevens, on that. It's still very much around that. It would be a discussion with the Regional Schools Commissioner and the local authority about the best action for that school in the circumstances. At the moment, I mean, you'll be aware that if a school is judged inadequate, it gets its academy order. At the moment, the 2 or 3 RI schools, there isn't that, and I think what they want to do, what they're attempting to do in the schools bill, is to bring that in so that there's more intervention on schools that have 2 or more RI judgments. But at the minute, there's no compulsion around that. It's about a discussion. So that would be the link with the RSC.
So just for clarity, Councillor Pryor, when you gave us a figure earlier that 100% maintained schools are good and outstanding, that figure's 100% because the schools that were failed by the local authority have been forced to be academies. So your 100% cannot include the ones that have been forced into academies.
That was 100% of secondary schools. RI schools would have counted in that, but there aren't any local authority secondary schools which require improvement. But it's probably also worth mentioning that 64% of schools in Leeds, I think it's about 64%, are still local authority maintained schools, which is a figure considerably higher than a lot of other authorities around the country. So while on one respect you are correct that of course schools which have been judged to be inadequate wouldn't feature in that because they would have been academised, the figure of schools that have been pushed down that route is significantly lower in Leeds compared to other local authorities.
Okay, right. Thank you, everybody. So I think one thing that was clear in the discussion is there's an awful lot of information still to come out about this. So I think there's a high level of interest among the board. So what I'm going to suggest is if when in February we discuss the 3A strategy next, perhaps we could include as part of that discussion any updates. If there's something significant in the meantime that's timely for one of our meetings, that would be helpful. But I think February seems probably a sensible timeline to get a further update on this, if everyone's happy with that, because there's a lot still to come, I think. Okay, so we can move on to item 10, which is our work schedule. And I will ask Angela to take us through this item, please. Sorry, for the benefit of anyone who's not in the room, then just making some technical adjustments.
Thank you, Chair. While we're doing those adjustments, I'll briefly introduce the work schedule. So this report relates to the board's work schedule, and the latest version is set out in Appendix 1 for members' consideration. The key element to note really is in relation to the board's inquiry into children's services workforce planning, and it's now being proposed that a working group meeting is held to discuss the potential scope for the board's forthcoming inquiry work, with a view to bringing the draft terms of reference back to the October meeting for approval. Within the schedule, it indicates a date to be confirmed, and we have now identified this date as being Wednesday, 28th of February at 10 o'clock, which will September at 10 o'clock, which will be held remotely as well. So board members will receive an invitation following today's meeting. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Stevenson.
Just on the work schedule, Chair, I'm conscious that in October we've got the notification of child safeguarding review due, but there's no reference there to the update on the child A review, and we had a long session on that previously. I don't want that to be lost, so can we make sure that on the item we also have an update on the Child A review, which members will remember is the case we discussed at length about what we could and couldn't discuss, and we were promised an update once the review was complete, which I believe it is.
Yeah, we can do that. Okay, so item 11 is the date and time of next meeting, which is Wednesday, the 12th of October at 10 o'clock. As always, a pre-meeting at 9:45. But can I thank everyone for your contributions this morning? We've got through a lot, as always. Very grateful, and see you next time. Thank you.